He was the greatest of all Finnish symphonists. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Jean Sibelius. Sibelius was born in December 1865 in the south of Finland, when the country was a part of the Russian Empire. The family underwent turmoil early on. When Sibelius was only 2.5 years old, his father died, leaving behind a pregnant widow who was forced to move in with her mother due to the family's severe debts. Like Alexander Scriabin in Russia, Sibelius's role models and environment were practically all female. His uncle was the only man in the picture, and he took on a fatherly role to Sibelius, introducing him to the violin 3 years after he'd been first exposed to the piano. Sibelius liked the violin more than the piano, and he enjoyed improvising on both. But it wasn't until the mid-1880s, about a half-decade after he first picked it up, that he began to fully commit himself to it. This is around the same time he also started writing his first pieces. At first, his dream was to become the next great virtuoso violinist, and he was indeed quite good. Not quite good enough to get into the Vienna Philharmonic, though. He was just too nervous. It was his perfect pitch that drove him towards the violin more so than the piano. His family had an old square piano which was pretty much universally flat, and whenever he was first exposed to a properly tuned piano, it was too sharp for him, and he didn't like it as much. Like Robert Schumann, an initial attempt at studying law proved abortive, and he would end up studying music throughout the late 1880s in Helsinki, at an institution that would later change its name to the Jean Sibelius Academy. Unlike many other historical examples of composers who bucked their family's wishes in order to pursue music, Sibelius's family was very supportive. He would soon come to know a who's who list of musicians not just in Finland, but also in the German-speaking world further south. He even managed to get a grant to visit Berlin and study there, worth nearly $10,000 in today's money. His primary composition professor in Finland was Martin Wigelius, which, it's not super relevant, but Sibelius, Wigelius, it's funny to me. His travels and his studies led him to an important but still devastating realization. He would never be a violin virtuoso. He blamed it on the fact that he really started getting serious about the instrument when he was 15. Much too late. But the abandonment of the dual path of composition and violin meant that he had much more time for the former. And it's around this time, where he spent a lot of time in Vienna partying, that he wrote his first orchestral music, and this was going to be his calling card. Yet even though he was in Vienna, he was not able to take any lessons with the two composers he wanted to study with, Johannes Brahms and Anton Bruckner. They both turned him down. In particular, it was Krievo, a set of choral orchestral tone poems loosely resembling a symphony, that proved Sibelius's worth as a Finnish artist. Though it only received scattered performances in his lifetime after its premiere, its decidedly Finnish artistic slant, as it dealt with a famous Finnish character from Finnish folklore and set the Finnish language to music, this really set the tone for everything that was to come later in his career. Much of his orchestral music drew inspiration from Finnish culture, which meant that he was warmly received in Helsinki, but more coolly received in other places. His wife Ainola said that it was Krievo's success that convinced her parents to let her marry him. The Russians, however, they didn't like this new nationalism too much. Finland was a part of the Russian Empire, as I mentioned, but it was technically a grand duchy, which meant that it did have some autonomy. But as the 1800s gave way to the 1900s, Tsar Nicholas II cracked down on this nationalistic wave that Sibelius was riding. In particular, a tone poem initially titled Finland Awakens, but later retitled to the more familiar name of Finlandia, that was a center of attention. And for several occasions, it had to be retitled for different performances yet again, so it would fly under the radar of the authorities, who were scared of this piece's ability to rouse sentiments of Finnish nationalism and Finnish independence. In a different piece, he said a text initially written to honor Tsar Alexander II, so the Russians couldn't do anything about it, even though its tone was definitely one of protest. This sense of nationalism may very well have been inspired by his early love of Richard Wagner, who did the same thing with Germanic tales and Germanic nationalism, using these stories and its language in order to provide for great and gripping works of, in Wagner's case, dramatic theater, but in Sibelius's case, purely orchestral music or choral orchestral music. Sibelius would later grow to resent Wagner's music, as he saw the German as being full of himself, which, to be fair, isn't exactly wrong. The instruments, to Sibelius early on in his career, needed to be guided by an underlying poetic purpose, and that true art was where words and music collided, which was a very Wagnerian idea. And while this is definitely true for his early pieces and for the songs he'd written and for many of the songs he would come to write, this is not something he followed when you look at his really great works. He forged his own path independent of other influences. This is only really valid when you're looking at this early stage of his career. Sibelius was always a big fan of a good party, and accounts exist of him spending exorbitant amounts, only to wind up with very little in the bank soon after. He was known to spend $250 in today's money in a single evening, which I guess is okay every now and then, but this was a recurring thing, and he did not have that kind of disposable income. He seems to have suffered from some form of depression and melancholy. What exactly is a matter of speculation. His loving and dedicated wife Aino would implore him to come back to their home in the countryside, away from the hustle and bustle of Helsinki, but often to no avail. Of his younger compositional colleague Erkki Mallarton's suite The Melancholy Garden, Sibelius wrote that he had found a very apt expression for solitude, and that he understood such things very well. It's not at all a stretch to say that his vices may have had something to do with him trying to escape whatever plagued him internally. Sibelius's first symphony was an accomplishment, but it was his second symphony where he really started to take off. Critics were polarized at first, perhaps because they were reading too much of a nationalistic, patriotic sentiment into every single one of Sibelius's works, as opposed to just a good chunk of them. But either way, it established his reputation as a masterful symphonist. It might be telling that the international critics, particularly the German ones, were not as uniformly enthusiastic about the symphony as the Finns were. Not to be outdone, 1904's Violin Concerto is still considered one of the premier masterpieces for the instrument and one of the premier masterpieces in that genre. This makes sense because it was the instrument at which Sibelius most excelled. Sibelius would have loved to have played it himself, no doubt, but it was beyond his technical capabilities on the instrument, and besides, he did have pretty severe stage fright. Its initial dedicatee shunned it after scheduling conflicts prevented him from playing in the first few performances, and it eventually landed in the hands of Franz von Wechsy, a virtuoso who was at that point 12 years old. Much of the 1900s were spent building, or raising money for building, a house for himself, his wife, and their 3 daughters, as a 4th had died in childhood. Their final 2 daughters would only ever know this house as their childhood home. He named it Ainola after his wife. The literal translation is Aino's place, and it was a little less than 25 miles north of Helsinki. Its location meant that he was still close enough to the city, but still had enough time to spend with his family. The house was constructed to various specifications to help maximize Sibelius's productivity as a composer. Part of this meant that there was to be no excess noise. The daughters were banned from practicing inside the house, and the gutters were made of wood to negate the sound of running water. In fact, he tried to make it so there was no running water at all anywhere near the house. Speaking of partying, though, Sibelius was so egregious in his excesses in 1907 that Aino suffered from exhaustion and had to be hospitalized. Because he would blow through so much money, it was up to her to find ways to compensate in the budget, which meant taking all of their daughters out of school and homeschooling them instead, as well as tending to the family garden because they didn't have nearly as much money for supplies. Sibelius was rightfully horrified at what his behavior had wrought, and swore off drinking and smoking, and with it the collection of ashtrays that he rotated around to fit his mood. It had already done a ton of damage. He had 2 throat cancer-related operations within the year. Bleakness wormed its way into his music, specifically the 4th Symphony, which confused several international audiences with its relentless, foreboding, tense, and overall pessimistic outlook. With each successive symphony, he managed to go in a completely different direction. By the time he got around to his 6th, he compared it to cold spring water, while all the other composers he knew were offering up increasingly complicated cocktails. Sibelius was in the United States when World War I broke out, and the royalties he got from international publications dwindled to nothing as the continent tore itself apart. The pieces he wrote for national publication weren't enough to sustain his lifestyle, and he was incredibly in debt. Even worse is that the stress of the times led him back to the bottle, after a period of sobriety lasting the better part of a decade. The international geopolitics were just insane. Russia attempted to gain more power over the Grand Duchy, only to have them fall in their own revolution, and then, as soon as that happened, Finland's Senate declares its own independence, and is within a month embroiled in its own civil war. Exhaustion, headaches, and shakiness in his hands began to plague Sibelius more and more. This even extended into peacetime Europe, where he was once again able to travel around and have his works performed internationally. Of course, he might show up to a premiere tipsy or completely smashed, take your pick, but somehow he was still able to write music that was as good and as powerful as ever, which is really kind of difficult. Hey, you try orchestrating while slurping down a whole bottle of wine and you see how far you get. Actually, that's not fair. His quiet composition times were accompanied by bottles of whiskey, not wine. Even though Finland had prohibition laws, he had doctor friends who would prescribe it, the old rheumatiz medicine approach. On one occasion, when he was in Sweden to conduct a concert of his works, he got drunk before the performance, they had to drag him in late, and then after the first few bars, he stopped because he thought it was a rehearsal instead. The thing is, musicians actually really liked playing under him. He was apparently a very good conductor when it came to his own works. He was good at knowing what he wanted and then being able to embody that to an ensemble through his motions. By the mid-1920s, his health had seen a major decline. The number of completed works dwindled to nothing, but rumors still abounded of a mysterious 8th symphony. His 7 completed symphonies constitute a unique cycle, and he found it psychologically difficult to put out each successive one, remarking to his friend Gustav Mahler that he seemed to lose friends and advocates of his music whenever he put out a new symphony. Those who liked the second were baffled by the third, those who liked the third didn't like the fourth, and so on. He also didn't want to take a step backwards in his work. He only seemed to want to put out an 8th if he could in some aspect one-up his 7th, which was extremely formally innovative, and one movement at that. But he never came out with an 8th symphony. He became increasingly bitter about his music, and he refused to discuss it. Ainola recalled that he burned large swaths of his work in 1945, and whatever he had of the 8th, likely a fair amount according to most scholars, was eaten in the flames. Only a few drafts survived, a few scattered pages and sketches here and there, which somehow made it through this purging of his works. But these would only be discovered relatively recently and long after his death. Though he would lie about its release to any interested parties, the fact is that he had stopped even trying to write his 8th symphony. The creative act in and of itself had become too much of a burden on him, and he was only able to get through it in the latter years of his career by consuming reckless amounts of alcohol. Tapiola, a tone poem premiered in 1926, was to be his last, final big artistic statement, although it's a pervading myth that he was totally silent from then on out. Sure, he didn't compose anything with the scale of Tapiola, but he did write a few pieces here and there, specifically ritual music for the Freemasons, of whom he was a part. But these were small in scope and scale, and it really wasn't a whole lot. When Soviet forces invaded, in the so-called Winter War that constituted part of World War II, Sibelius got out a shotgun and took pot shots at Russian pilots. Not that it did anything, he just wanted to get his anger out. While the other Scandinavian countries and the United States offered asylum, he steadfastly refused, saying that it was not the Finnish way. And he was right. Even though the Finnish forces were vastly outnumbered, and the Soviets were able to take some land, the Finns inflicted such heavy losses on the Soviets that it could be considered, in many ways, a victory for the Finnish people. The uncertainty of the time has meant that the family had to move around a little bit in order to escape the possibility of Soviet bombing raids, but by and large they stayed at Ainola. He was still such a major force in Finnish music that in 1953 it was his recommendation that got the young and up-and-coming Anihani Rautavaara into Juilliard. His silence for so long on all things music-related made his enthusiasm for Rautavaara that much more profound. The question of why exactly he went silent in the last decades of his life remains a mystery. However, it's not one of these mysteries where we just don't know anything. The problem is we have too many plausible theories. Was it the immense pressure he felt to write an 8th after he had been built up to be a national hero? Was it his stringent pessimism when it came to his own works? the same self-criticism that led him to rewrite and restructure all of his previous symphonies? Was it, from a more practical perspective, his shakiness due to his years of alcohol abuse? Or, on the other hand, was his shakiness even alcohol-related at all because he said wine helped soothe it? Or maybe he felt pressure to write and publish just to make money, and once he was freed from his debts, he felt no such impetus to publish something he felt was not up to his standards, and his stringent self-criticism just took over and completely shut down his ability to write? Or was it the constant influx of gifts and honors and politicians and conductors and other bigwigs with whom he had to contend seemingly at all hours in his own home? It's hard to say. It was likely a combination of some, if not all of these factors that led to his creative block that lasted for so long. Despite the roughness of his life and his close brush with throat cancer, Sibelius lived to the hearty old age of 91, passing away in September 1957 of a brain hemorrhage. Aino outlived him by 12 years, dying at the age of 97. Thereafter, their beloved Ainola was sold to Finland and converted into a museum honoring their national hero. He had been deified by his own people in his own homeland in his own lifetime, which must have struck a note of irony to him because he was not part of the Finnish-speaking majority. He was part of the Swedish-speaking minority. He also long received a government pension. Not enough to live off of, but enough to alleviate the most dire of financial times. While his spending habits didn't help matters, he didn't always get money for performances or for royalties of his pieces outside the Russian Empire when Finland was a part of Russia. Even though international copyright was a thing, it was not secured in Finland until their independence. It's fair to say that Sibelius's major accomplishments lie in his 7 symphonies, which bridge the gap between late Romanticism and the earliest tinges of modernism. He loved the music of Anton Bruckner, which can be seen in some of his tempo and orchestrational choices, and his use of small motifs and cells, which he then grows into larger and larger structures, seems to presage Bela Bartok's use of the same technique, specifically in the great Hungarian composer's cycle of string quartets. Sibelius's conceptualization of the symphony also was diametrically opposed to the conceptualization brought forth by Gustav Mahler. Though the two composers were friends and they got along, it was to Sibelius that Mahler had said his famous quote of the symphony being like the world and embracing everything, whereas Sibelius wanted something with a cohesion to it that didn't have to be an hour and a half to make sense. This isn't to say that Sibelius's music is not warm, quite the opposite in fact. He himself compared his best pieces to aspects of nature he really enjoyed. You might occasionally hear the idea that the death of the symphony came with the death of Mahler, but that's only when you're talking about the Germanic arc of symphonic composers that began with Haydn and ended with Mahler. But the symphony, as its own genre, was still going strong, and Sibelius became the world's leading symphonist. Many enterprising composers sought to emulate Sibelius in their own works, specifically British composers, for a reason I'm not entirely sure of. Each of the 7 also tackles unique problems then facing the symphony as a genre. The path as embodied in the German-speaking world may have fizzled out, but the symphony was still going strong. Sibelius saw tonality as a faltering path, as did many 20th century composers, but he offered no solution. For Arnold Schoenberg and his followers, it was negation of tonality, and the establishment of mathematically informed organizational frameworks. But to Sibelius it was to be found in the vibrancy and timeless quality of folk music, even though he offered no strict paradigms, and he always dealt in folk idioms rather than outright quotations. Yet Sibelius actually really liked Schoenberg, specifically his early chamber symphony, and he was also intrigued by Scriabin's idea of a music that included visual elements, specifically light. Sibelius did not exclusively write for the orchestra. He did write a lot of non-orchestral music. The thing is, that stuff just isn't ranked as highly as his orchestral pieces in their respective pantheons. I know some folks who really enjoy his piano music, for instance, but to me, this stuff is just unnecessarily limiting. He was such a natural for the orchestra. He was so good at understanding how the orchestra worked, and the orchestra fit his musical language like a glove, so much so that when he writes for smaller ensembles, it sounds like he's unnecessarily limiting himself to a smaller tonal palette. His genius lay in the larger scale, not the smaller scale. Why? Well, it sometimes goes back to funds. It wasn't just Sibelius that was caught in this. Many other composers did. They wrote pieces that would sell more immediately because the time it takes to write an orchestral piece and then have it corrected and then published and then out there to the world of conductors and orchestras, you just weren't going to see money flow in from that piece that quickly. And again, I want to make it clear, this is not unique to Sibelius. In the end, though, he didn't really care what the critics thought, as he said that no statue had ever been put up to honor a critic. And to this day, that remains true.